I'm breaking down 5 game-changing adjustments that'll have you scooping pots and stacking chips like never before. These aren't just tips, they're strategies, built to take advantage of trends and player habits you'll see in every game this year. Let's start with one of the most important adjustments, building your own strategy instead of copying everyone else's predictable play. Low stakes players often follow GTO charts they don't fully understand, and that's where we take our advantage. Imagine this scenario, you're in a 1-2 game and you raise a pre-flop to $10 with pocket kings. The button calls and the flop comes Jack 7-3 rainbow. You continuation bet for $15 and your opponent calls. The turn is an 8 and you bet again, this time for 30 and you get another call. The river pairs the board with another 7. Now let's slow down and analyze. When your opponent calls both flop and turn, what can we put them on? Their ranges likely includes hands like Jack X top pair with a medium kicker, maybe pocket pairs like 8s or 9s, or even 10s that are trying to control the pot. They might even also have straight draws like 9-10 or gut shots like Queen 10. The big question is, do they have a monster or they're just hanging out with marginal hands? Here's where we break patterns. Instead of firing another standard half pot bet of 60 to get these hands to call, you overbet, let's say 150. This oversized bet applies immense pressure. If they're holding something like Jack 10, they're going to struggle really hard. Even hands as strong as pocket 9s might start to call because your line doesn't really make sense to them. We even gather more information if they actually end up making the call. This will tell us if the player is either very sticky with a margin of value hand or has slow played a monster like pocket jacks. We take our note and adjust for future pots. Alternatively, let's flip the script. Same scenario, but this time you check the river instead of betting. Why? This is to induce a bluff. If our opponent has missed draws like Queen 10, 9-10, or even some backdoor flushes that they arrived there with, they're likely to see your check as weakness and fire a big bet trying to steal the pot. You can call me slap call, and now you're trapped their bluff, adding more to your stack without taking unnecessary risks, and you'll get more information about their playstyle. The key takeaway here is use non-standard bet sizing and unexpected checks to create chaos. This will give you a lot more information about the player and their type, and you're forcing them into situations they're not comfortable in. EV and GTO are just concepts and not everyone understands them, so use that to your advantage. Let's talk about double check raising out of position against tight pre-flop players, especially when we're deep stacked and facing dynamic boards. You're in a 1-2 game, sitting in the big blind with 9-8 of spades. To cut off, a tight and disciplined player raises to $8. The button 3 bets to 20 and the action falls to you. You're sitting with 700 in your stack and you decide to call, knowing the cutoff's range is heavily weighted towards premiums and the button 3 bet could be strong. The flop comes Jack of spades, 7 of hearts, 4 of clubs, you check and the cutoff bets 25. The button folds, instead of just calling, you decide to check raise to 80. Immediately applying pressure, targeting hands that might be ahead of you, but if you hit a straight or backdoor flush, your implied odds can increase significantly because you can get all the money in. Now the cutoff calls. The turn brings a 10 of diamonds, completing your straight. You check again, letting the cutoff feel confident. He bets 75 as any overpair or a hand like ace-jack would do, and this is where we check raise again to 200, leaving yourself the 320 behind. In this spot, the type player with a holding of ace-jack or better will feel pot committed and obligated to call this turn raise again. We only have a half pot size bet behind on the river, so they will also feel committed to call any river bet. The river is the 2 of clubs, complete blank. With $610 in the pot, you move all in with your remaining 320, putting maximum pressure on any overpairs or any top pair hands, and in these spots, low stakes players can never justify a fold because top pair or an overpair or hands of that nature will construct their majority of their opening range after they call a 3 bet. But why does this work? Type players don't like playing for stacks without the nuts, especially on dynamic boards like this one where draws complete. But if their hand is good enough, they will keep calling until an extremely scary card comes. It's simply really hard for them to fold what they like pre-flop. They'll call themselves unlucky that they lost with aces or kings and they just fume while you collect your chips. When you're deep stacked and you're against a low stakes nit, going for a double check raise with high equity and doing it again when you actually hit is extremely effective. Like in this scenario, we've built a pot while holding the nuts, punish the hands that can't handle heavy aggression, and this player's inelasticity and being a low stakes player. Before we go into the next one, if you've enjoyed this video up until this point, I would appreciate if you could subscribe, as 98% of the people who watch me are not. On to the next one. Let's talk about one of the most underrated aspects of poker success: game selection and beating the rake. No matter how good your strategy is, playing in the wrong games or underestimating the impact of rake can wipe out your profits and even lead to long-term losses. Imagine this scenario. You're in a 1-2 game with a $5 rake cap per hand, and you have a 5 big blinds per 100 win rate. That's a solid edge, but let's break it down. The average pot in this game is $50, meaning you're paying $5 in rake on nearly every hand that goes to showdown. Over 100 hands, that's $500 in rake. If your edge is only 5 big blinds per 100, or 10 per 100 hands, you're barely scraping by after rake. Now let's consider what happens if your edge drops to 3 big blind. Now, you're actually losing money in this game, despite playing really well. What makes a game winnable? Well, the first thing is to look at the other players' tendencies. Loose passive games where players limp too much and cold down light are gold mines. Games with overly aggressive players can also be profitable if you're comfortable exploiting them in spots, but they come with higher variance. Second factor is the rake structure. Think about these scenarios: a 1-2 game with a $5 rake cap, 2-5 game with a $6 rake cap, and a 5-10 game with a $7 rake cap. If you look at these, the first one is a 2.5 big blind cap, second one is 1.2 big blind cap, third one is 0.7 big blind cap. The higher stakes you go, the lower the relative rake, which is why serious players often move up in the stakes as the skills improve. One way to mitigate the impact of rake in smaller games is to play in deep stack games where the effective sizes are 200 big blinds or more. Here is why this helps. When the pots are larger, the rake cap becomes smaller compared to the percentage of the pot. So in a $50 pot, a $5 rake is 10%, but in a $200 pot, it's only 2.5. Deep stacks allow you to extract more value from your opponents when you hit the big hands, making it easier to compensate for that rake. So hands like suited connectors or high nut equity hands get more value. Players at low stakes often misplay in the deep stack situations, making very costly errors by overvaluing one pair hands and failing to adjust their ranges. With deeper stacks, you can apply more pressure through overbets and multi-street aggression, forcing your opponents into very hard decisions, which they're highly likely going to misplay. Let's take a quick look at risk of ruin calculations and understand bankroll management. If you have a 5 big blind per 100 win rate with a standard deviation of 80 big blinds, your risk of ruin can be calculated as this equation. What risk of ruin really means is how likely are you to lose your entire bankroll. With a $5,000 bankroll in this example, with the parameters we've given in, your risk of ruin is 0.0002% chance of going broke, which is pretty good, that's extremely low. But what happens if your edge drops to 2 big blinds per 100? And now you have a 0.19% chance, still small, but noticeably higher percent of going bankrupt. But when the rake comes into the play, which tanks your win rate, the risk of ruin can go huge, like in this example where it has climbed up significantly. So the key takeaways is you need to choose games where your edge exceeds the rake, and you should avoid low stakes games with high rake caps unless the competition is extremely soft, and look for very deep stacked games or games that have low relative rake. Pick home games and use tools like variance calculators to estimate the risk of ruin in your bankroll so you can handle that swing. Let's look at how blocker theory can help us to make bluff catching calls, especially when facing aggression on scary boards. This is one of the most underutilized aspects of poker strategy, even among the experienced players in live games. Here in a 1-2 game and in the cutoff with ace of spades, jack of clubs, hijack raises to $8, you call, and the button folds. The flop comes king of spades, queen of diamonds, and 7 of spades, giving you a gut shot straight draw and backdoor flush equity. Hijack bets 12, you call. The turn is the 2 of hearts, total blank. The hijack bets 30, and you call again, knowing that your opponent's range includes strong hands like ace queen, ace king, or even 2 pairs, but also semi-bluffs like flush draws like jack 10. The river is the 8 of diamonds, completing no draws. Hijack fires 75 into 125, leaving you with a tough decision. Here blockers come into play. Your hand, ace of spades, jack of clubs, blocks nut flush draws like ace 10 of spades, straight draws like jack 10. By holding ace of spades, you make it less likely that your opponent has missed the nut flush draw, removing a lot of bluffs from their range, and at the same time, the bet of 75 is huge compared to the pot. Given that you're blocking the hands that your opponent could bluff with, you won't even go for a bluff check raise here, or a ace high hero call, as your opponent would be really value heavy. Now let's look at a different scenario where the river is the jack of spades instead, giving you the third pair and completes the flush. Now a couple of straights get there, and when your opponent bets the same size, you have the option to go for a raise to a massive size. Because you're holding the ace of spades, you're effectively turning your hand into a bluff, because your opponent is less likely to hold spades, especially bigger ones. Your opponent's probably sitting there with a hand like a pair, two pair, or a set that can't handle all-in sizing, especially if you're deep stacked. So in this case, we will be using the blocker theory to understand that the opponent has no nutted hands left in their range, so we can easily get them off of their holdings by applying max pressure. The fifth and the most important exploit is bet sizing tells. While bet sizing is often overlooked, it's a goldmine for picking apart opponents' ranges, especially at low stakes where many players are unaware of how their sizing reveals their intentions. You're in a 1-2 game on the button with King of Diamonds, Queen of Diamonds. The hijack player with $500 behind raises to 8. You call, and the big blind also calls. The flop comes Jack of Hearts, 10 of Clubs, 2 of Spades, giving you an open-ended straight draw. Big blind checks, and now the hijack bets $10 into a $25 pot, just 40%. What does the sizing tell us? On a connected board like Jack 10 Deuce, a strong value hand like Ace Jack or Jacks would typically bet larger to protect against many draws. The small bet often represents either a weak top pair or a speculative holding like Ace X with some backdoor draws, or a hand with little equity trying to set a cheap price for the turn. You decide to go for a raise to 35, applying pressure, the big blind folds, and the hijack calls. The turn is the 4 of diamonds, complete blank, hijack checks, you bet 16 to 95, targeting hands like weak top pair or overcards, the hijack folds, and you scoop the pot. As in this example, small bets or wet dynamic boards often indicate a capped range. Players with strong hands will typically bet larger to deny equity draws. Exploit this by raising semi-bluffs or applying pressure with polarized ranges on wet boards. On dry, disconnected flops like King 7 Deuce, larger bets often polarize an opponent's range into bluffs or very strong hands like Ace King, or middling sets like 7s, deuces, or kings. Against these bets, call with hands that have strong implied odds or blocker effects, and wait for later streets to extract maximum value. Overbets on the river. When an opponent overbets on the river, their range is heavily polarized. Look at earlier streets for clues. If their line represents strength, but the board runout does not improve their value hands, their overbet is often a bluff. If their aggression escalates consistently on coordinated boards, be cautious of hands like straights or flushes. The reason this works is unintentional transparency bias is a thing. Many players at low stakes don't balance their bet sizes, making their range predictable, especially when they're in the moment. Player tendencies. Aggressive players tend to overuse large sizings as bluffs, while passive players underutilize small sizings for traps. Exploiting frequency gaps is by carefully observing how your opponents use different sizings so you can adjust your strategy to counter their imbalances in what they're doing. So your takeaway is that bet sizing tells are everywhere. Whether it's a timid small bet or intimidating overbet, every size has a story. Your job is to read it, adjust accordingly, and punish players who wear their intentions on their sleeves. In 2025, you'll be mastering all of these skills so that you're winning consistently in your poker games. Good luck, and if you've enjoyed this one, you could go and watch me play my regular cash game and tell how I did, and if I've used these strategies, I'll see you in the next one.